Ronald Belford Bon Scott, the 9th of July 1946, the 19th of February 1980, was an Australian singer and songwriter, best known for being the lead vocalist and lyricist of the Australian hard rock band AC/DC from 1974 until his death in 1980. Scott was born in Forfar in Angus, Scotland, and spent his early years in Kirriemuir. He moved to Australia with his family in 1952 at the age of 6, living in Melbourne for 4 years before settling in Fremantle, Western Australia. Scott formed his first band, The Spectres, in 1964 and became the band's drummer and occasional lead vocalist. He performed in several other bands, including the Valentines and Fraternity, before replacing Dave Evans as the lead singer of AC/DC in 1974. AC/DC's popularity grew throughout the 1970s, initially in Australia, and then internationally. Their 1979 album Highway to Hell reached the top 20 in the United States, and the band seemed on the verge of a commercial breakthrough. However, on the 19th of February 1980, Scott died after a night out in London with former musician and alleged drug dealer Alistair Kinnear. AC/DC briefly considered disbanding, but the group recruited vocalist Brian Johnson of the British glam rock band Geordie. AC/DC's subsequent album, Back in Black, was released only 5 months later, and was a tribute to Scott. It went on to become the second best-selling album in history. In the July 2004 issue of Classic Rock, Scott was rated as #1 in a list of the 100 greatest frontmen of all time. Hit Parade ranked Scott as 5th on their 2006 list of the 100 greatest heavy metal vocalists of all time. Ronald Belford Scott was born on the 9th of July 1946 at Fife Jamieson Maternity Hospital in Forfar, Scotland, the son of Charles Belford Chick Scott, 1917 to 1999, and Isabel Cunningham Isa Mitchell, 1917 to 2011. He grew up in Kirriemuir and was his parents' second child. The firstborn was a boy, Sandy, who died shortly after birth. A third child, Derek, was born in 1949. The Scott family moved from Scotland to Australia in 1952. They initially lived in the Melbourne suburb of Sunshine, Victoria, and Scott attended nearby Sunshine Primary School. The nickname Bon was acquired shortly after starting school, because there was another Ronald in the class. His classmates played on the phrase Bonnie Scotland. A fourth child, Graham, was born in 1953. In 1956, the family moved to Fremantle. Scott joined the associated Fremantle Scots Pipe Band, learning the drums. He attended North Fremantle Primary School and later John Curtin College of the Arts until he dropped out at the age of 15. He subsequently worked as a farmhand and a crayfisherman, and was later a trainee weighing machine mechanic. In 1963 he spent a short time in Fremantle Prison's Assessment Centre and 9 months at the Riverbank Juvenile Institution, relating to charges of giving a false name and address to the police, having escaped legal custody, having unlawful carnal knowledge, and stealing 12 imperial gallons, 55 litres, of petrol. He attempted to join the Australian Army, but was rejected and deemed socially maladjusted. Scott's vocals were inspired by his idol, Little Richard. After working as a postman, bartender and truck packer, Scott started his first band, The Spectres, in 1964 as drummer and occasional lead singer. In 1966 they merged with another local band, the Winstons, and formed the Valentines, in which Scott was co-lead singer with Vince Lovegrove. The Valentines recorded several songs written by George Young of the Easy Beats. Every Day I Have to Cry, a song originally written and sung by Arthur Alexander, made the local record chart. In 1970, after gaining a place on the national top 30 with their single Juliet, the Valentines disbanded due to artistic differences after a much publicized drug scandal. Scott moved to Adelaide in 1970 and joined the progressive rock band Fraternity. Fraternity released the LPs Livestock and Flaming Galah before touring the UK in 1973, where they changed their name to Fang. During this time they played support slots for Status Quo and Geordie, whose frontman Brian Johnson would eventually succeed Scott as the lead singer of AC/DC after his death. During this time, on the 24th of January 1972, Scott married Irene Thornton. In 1973, just after returning to Australia from the tour of the UK, Fraternity went on hiatus. Scott took a day job at the Wallaroo fertilizer plant and began singing with the Mount Lofty Rangers, a loose collective of musicians helmed by Peter Head, née Beagley, from Headband, who explained, "Headband and Fraternity were in the same management stable and we both split about the same time, so the logical thing was to take members from both bands and create a new one. The purpose of the band was for songwriters to relate to each other and experiment with songs, so it was a hotbed of creativity." Other Rex Fraternity members also played with the band, as did Glenn Shaw at Pre-Little River Band. During this time, Head also helped Scott with his original compositions. Vince Lovegrove said, "Bon would go to Peter's home after a day off, literally, shoveling shit, and show him musical ideas he had had during his day's work." Bon's knowledge of the guitar was limited, so Peter began teaching him how to bridge chords and construct a song. One of the songs from these sessions was a ballad called Clarissa, about a local Adelaide girl. Another was the country-tinged "Been Up in the Hills Too Long," which for me was a sign of things to come with Bon's lyrics, simple, clever, sardonic, tongue-in-cheek. In return, Scott recorded vocals for Mount Lofty Range's songs Round and Carey Gully. Head released these original recordings in 1996, also teaming up with producer Ted Yanni, another old friend of Scott's, to create an entirely new backing for Round that more accurately reflected the original intentions Head had. Long out of print, and massively bootlegged, this EP finally got an official digital release in June 2010. Unrecorded original compositions of Scott's Been Up in the Hills Too Long and Clarissa have been recorded by Head on his Peter Head and the Mount Lofty Range's Lofty album, also released in digital format only in 2011. About 11 p.m. on the 3rd of May 1974, at the Old Lion Hotel in North Adelaide, during a rehearsal with the Mount Lofty Rangers, a very drunk, distressed and belligerent Scott had a raging argument with a member of the band. Scott stormed out of the venue, threw a bottle of Jack Daniels onto the ground, then sped off on his Suzuki GT 550 motorbike. Scott suffered serious injuries from the ensuing motorcycle accident, spending 3 days in a coma and a further 18 days in hospital. Vince Lovegrove and his wife, by then running a booking/management agency, gave Scott odd jobs, such as putting up posters and painting the office during his recovery, and shortly after introduced him to AC/DC, who were on the lookout for a new lead singer. There was a young, dinky little glam band from Sydney that we both loved called AC/DC. Before another AC/DC visit, George Young phoned me and said the band was looking for a new singer. I immediately told him that the best guy for the job was Bon. George responded by saying Bon's accident would not allow him to perform, and that maybe he was too old. Nevertheless, I had a meeting with Malcolm and Angus, and suggested Bon as their new singer. They asked me to bring him out to the Paraka Hotel that night, and to come backstage after the show. When he watched the band, Bon was impressed, and he immediately wanted to join them, but thought they may be a bit too inexperienced and too young. After the show, backstage, Bon expressed his doubts about them being able to rock. The two young brothers told Bon he was able to rock. The upshot was that they had a jam session that night in the home of Bon's former mentor, Bruce Howe, and at the end of the session, at dawn, it was obvious that AC/DC had found a new singer. And Bon had found a new band. Like Scott, Malcolm Young and his younger brother Angus Young of AC/DC were born in Scotland before emigrating to Australia in their childhood with their family. Fraternity later reformed and replaced Scott with Jimmy Barnes. Scott's wife, Irene Thornton, later wrote, "The first time Bon saw AC/DC was in August 1974. They came through Adelaide with the Lou Reed and Stevie Wright tour, and played their own show at the Puraka Hotel. The first time I saw AC/DC was at the Puraka Hotel in September. Get up there, Bon," Vince kept saying. The band didn't have a singer that night, they were playing instrumental versions of old rock and roll standards. The boys ripped through all these classic numbers, and then finally, with enough pressure from Vince, Bon climbed onto the stage. "I didn't realize that AC/DC had just sacked Dave Evans and they wanted Bon to replace him. Like Bon, the Youngs were Scottish, so there was an instant bond." Scott replaced Dave Evans as the lead singer of AC/DC on the 24th of October 1974, when it became obvious the band and Evans were heading in different directions, with Evans having personal clashes with band members and management. Scott's appointment coincided with him working as a chauffeur for the band at the time until an audition promoted him to lead singer. With the Young brothers as lead and rhythm guitarists, session drummer Tony Currenty, AC/DC lineups, and George Young as a temporary bassist, AC/DC released High Voltage, their first LP in Australia, in February 1975. Within a few months Currenty was replaced by Phil Rudd and Mark Evans was hired as a permanent bassist, and AC/DC began recording their second album TNT, which was released in Australia in December 1975. The first AC/DC album to gain international distribution, however, was a compilation of tracks from the first two albums, also entitled High Voltage, which was released in May 1976. Another studio album, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, was released in September of the same year, but only in Australia. The international version of the album was released in December with a different track listing. The album was not released in the US until March 1981. In the following years, AC/DC gained further success with their albums Let There Be Rock and Powerage. The 1978 release of Powerage marked the debut of bassist Cliff Williams, who had replaced Mark Evans, and with its harder riffs, followed the blueprint set by Let There Be Rock. Only one single was released from Powerage, Rock'n'Roll Damnation, which gave AC/DC their highest chart position at the time, reaching number 24. An appearance at the Apollo Theatre in Glasgow during the Powerage tour was recorded and released as If You Want Blood You Got It. The band's sixth album, Highway to Hell, was produced by Robert Mutt Lang and was released in 1979. It became AC/DC's first LP to break the US Top 100, eventually reaching number 17, and it propelled AC/DC into the top ranks of hard rock acts. On February 9, 1980, AC/DC appeared on Aplauso TV, Spain, where they played Highway to Hell. This would be Bon Scott's last public appearance with AC/DC before his death. Scott met Irene Thornton, from Adelaide, in 1971 while he was the lead singer for Fraternity. They married in 1972. After 2 years of marriage, they separated before divorcing in 1977 but remained friends until his death. Michael Browning, who managed AC/DC in their early years, stated in his book on managing AC/DC, Dog Eat Dog, that he visited Scott in hospital in Melbourne in 1975 after Scott had overdosed on drugs. Browning claimed Bon was bragging to me the last time he was in that hospital he was visiting two separate girls, both unknown to each other, who were both giving birth to his kids at the same time. So there's at least two of Bon Scott's children out there, or at least two I can vouch for. On the 15th of February 1980, Scott attended a session where Malcolm and Angus Young were working on the beginnings of two songs that would later be recorded on the Back in Black album, Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You, with Scott accompanying on drums rather than singing or writing lyrics. Days earlier, Scott had gone with Mick Cox to visit their friends the French group Trust in the Scorpio Sound studio in London, where they recorded the album Repression. Scott was working on the English adaptation of texts by Bernie Bonvoisin for the English version of the album. During this visit, the musicians did a jam session of Ride On. This improvised session was Scott's last recording. Sometime during the late evening of the 18th of February and early morning of the 19th of February, Scott passed out and died at the age of 33. He had just visited a London club called the Music Machine, currently known as Coco. He was left to sleep in a Renault 5 owned by a friend of Scott's, Alistair Kinnear, at 67 Overhill Road in East Dulwich. Later that day, Kinnear found Scott lifeless, and alerted the authorities. Scott was taken to King's College Hospital in Camberwell, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. The official report of the coroner concluded that Scott had died of acute alcohol poisoning and classified it as death by misadventure. The chronology of events on the 19th of February and when exactly Scott was found dead has been challenged by Jesse Fink's 2017 book Bon, The Last Highway, which quotes late UFO guitarist Paul Chapman as having been informed early that morning by Scott's friend Joe Fury that Scott was dead. Kinnear said he found Scott in the evening. Chapman claims Scott and Fury were with him the previous evening of the 18th of February and Scott left his apartment to buy heroin, never to return. Fink's book also reveals Scott and Kinnear were not alone in East Dulwich but with a third person, Zena Kakuli, who stayed over at Kinnear's apartment while Scott remained in the parked Renault. An updated edition of Fink's book released in 2018 produces new evidence that a fourth individual, Kakuli's husband the rock musician Peter Perrott, was also with Scott, Kinnear, and Kakuli. Fink contends that pulmonary aspiration of vomit was the cause of Scott's death via a suspected heroin overdose, but the official cause was listed on the death certificate as acute alcohol poisoning and classified as death by misadventure. As part of the funeral arrangements, Scott's body was embalmed by Desmond Henley, it was later cremated, and Scott's ashes were interred by his family at Fremantle Cemetery in Fremantle. Shortly after Scott's death, the remaining members of AC/DC briefly considered quitting, however, it was eventually decided that Scott would have wanted them to continue, and, with the Scott family's encouragement, the band hired Brian Johnson as their new vocalist. 5 months after Scott's death, AC/DC finished the work they began with Scott and released Back in Black as a tribute to him. The issue of whether Scott's lyrics were used, uncredited, on the album remains an enduring topic of debate. In Fink's Bon, The Last Highway, Scott's girlfriends Silver Smith, who died in 2016, and Holly X, a pseudonym, both claim Scott wrote the song You Shook Me All Night Long.